"This is my lazy father-in-law," my daughter-in-law said with a laugh, and within seconds, an entire room full of wealthy people was looking at me like I was some kind of joke. "Does he actually do anything?" one man asked, swirling a glass of sparkling water in his hand. "Not really," she replied before I could even open my mouth. "Mostly enjoys free time." The table erupted in laughter. My son looked down at the floor. I sat there smiling politely, while something inside my chest quietly broke. What none of them knew was that less than 48 hours later, those same people would discover a truth so shocking that the laughter would disappear from their faces entirely. And when it happened, the person who had introduced me as a lazy old man would be the one struggling to look me in the eye. Before I tell you what happened, I have a small favor to ask. If stories about family, respect, and second chances mean something to you, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel, but only if this story truly resonates with you. And I'd love to know where you're watching from today. Leave a comment with your city, your country, and your local time. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories travel around the world. My name is William Carter. I'm 72 years old, and the night I'm about to tell you about changed my family forever. It changed the way my son saw me. It changed the way my daughter-in-law saw me. And it exposed things that had been hidden behind smiles and expensive suits for years. The real lesson I learned from everything that happened is one I hope you'll stay until the end to hear. But first, let me take you back to where it all began. I live just outside Nashville, Tennessee, in a modest house I've owned for a long time. Nothing fancy. A two-bedroom place with a front porch, an old oak tree, and a pickup truck that has more miles on it than most people would believe. Most mornings I wake up before sunrise, make coffee, sit outside, and enjoy the quiet. At my age, peace becomes more valuable than almost anything money can buy. My son Michael lives about 30 minutes away with his wife Emily. Michael is a good man, hardworking, honest, the kind of person who still calls his father every week. Emily, on the other hand, was always harder to figure out. She was polite when other people were watching, friendly enough at family gatherings. But there was always something underneath. Something cold. Something that made me feel like she had already decided who I was long before she ever got to know me. "You should really upgrade that truck someday," she told me once while staring at my old Ford parked in the driveway. "It still runs," I said. "That's not really the point," she replied. Another time she walked through my house and smiled awkwardly. "It's cozy." The way she said it made the words sound like an insult. I learned not to react. At my age, you realize that arguing rarely changes anyone's opinion. A few weeks before everything fell apart, Michael called me on a Tuesday evening. "Dad, Emily's family is hosting a big dinner next month." I could hear hesitation in his voice. "Sounds nice," I said. "They want everyone there." There was a pause. "Everyone?" I asked. "Yeah." Another pause. "Dad, just promise me something." "What's that?" "If things get awkward, don't take it personally." I remember staring out the kitchen window as he said those words. The sky was turning orange over the trees. "Why would things get awkward?" I asked. Michael didn't answer right away. "Just promise me." Something in his voice made my stomach tighten. It wasn't fear exactly. It sounded more like guilt. The kind of guilt a person carries when they know something is wrong but don't know how to stop it. "Michael," I said quietly, "what aren't you telling me?" On the other end of the line, there was silence. Then I heard him exhale slowly. "Dad," he finally said, "there are things about Emily's family that you don't know yet." And before he could explain what he meant, another voice suddenly appeared in the background. And the moment I heard it, I realized whatever was coming was much bigger than I had imagined. I looked at the phone for a moment after Michael spoke, waiting for him to continue. But before he could say another word, I heard Emily's voice in the background. "Who are you talking to?" she asked. "Dad," Michael answered. There was a brief silence. Then I heard her laugh softly. "Tell him not to worry. My family doesn't bite." Something about the way she said it stayed with me long after the call ended. A few days later, I found myself thinking about how different Michael's life had become since he got married. When he was a boy, things were simple. We lived in a small house outside Nashville. We did not have much money, but we always had enough. Every Saturday morning, Michael and I would stop at the same diner for pancakes before heading to the hardware store. He loved following me through the aisles. "Dad, do we need all these tools?" he would ask. "Probably not," I would tell him. "But one day you will be glad we have them." Back then, he never cared how much money someone had. He judged people by how they treated others. That was something his mother and I worked hard to teach him. My wife, Susan, believed character mattered more than status. She used to tell Michael, "A person's bank account tells you how much money they have. Their actions tell you who they are." He never forgot those words. At least, I hoped he had not. After Susan passed away 8 years ago, things changed. Michael was already an adult by then, but losing her affected both of us. We stayed close. We called each other every week. We spent holidays together. Then he met Emily. At first, I was happy for him. She was smart, ambitious, and confident. But over time, I started noticing little things. Small moments that seemed harmless on their own. One Christmas, I brought Michael a handmade wooden toolbox I had spent weeks building in my garage. Emily opened it first. She smiled politely and said, "That is thoughtful." Then she handed Michael a designer watch that probably cost more than my truck was worth. Everyone gathered around to admire it. The toolbox sat unopened beside the tree for almost an hour. Michael eventually noticed and picked it up. "Dad, you made this?" he asked. "Sure did." He ran his hand across the wood and smiled. "This is my favorite gift." Emily's expression changed for only a second, but I noticed it. Another time, during a family dinner, her mother Patricia asked me, "So what do you do with all your free time these days?" Before I could answer, Emily jumped in. "Mostly gardening and fishing, I think." The table chuckled. I simply nodded. The truth was more complicated, but I saw no reason to explain myself. Over the years, I learned that some people only hear what confirms what they already believe. Then, about 2 weeks before the dinner Michael mentioned, something unusual happened. I received a phone call while working in my garage. The caller ID displayed a number I recognized immediately. I stepped outside before answering. The conversation lasted less than 10 minutes. When it ended, I sat quietly on the porch staring at the oak tree in my front yard. Susan had planted that tree decades earlier. I remember looking at it and thinking how strange life could be. Some secrets stay hidden for years. Others arrive all at once. Later that evening, Michael called again. His voice sounded tense. "Dad," he said, "I need to ask you something." "What is it?" I replied. There was a long pause before he finally spoke. "When you meet Emily's family next month, is there anything about you that I should know first?" I could hear something unusual in Michael's voice that night. He was not asking out of curiosity. He was asking because he was worried. I leaned back in my porch chair and looked out across the yard. The sun had already disappeared behind the trees. "Why would you ask me that?" I said. Michael hesitated. "Because Emily's family keeps talking about people they know. Investors, executives, business owners. And every time your name comes up, they act like they already have you figured out." I laughed quietly. "Most people do that." "Dad, I am serious." Another pause. "Is there something I do not know?" For years I would have changed the subject. For years I would have smiled and let everyone believe whatever they wanted. But something felt different this time. "Michael," I said, "have I ever asked anyone for money?" "No." "Have I ever depended on anybody to take care of me?" "No." "Then maybe people should spend less time guessing and more time asking questions." The silence that followed surprised both of us. I almost never pushed back. Not even a little. "Dad," he said slowly. "That is not really an answer." "I know." We ended the call a few minutes later. The next morning, I drove into downtown Nashville for a meeting. The building stood 30 stories high with glass walls that reflected the morning sky. Most people who saw me walk inside probably assumed I was there to fix something. I was wearing the same old brown jacket I had owned for years. The receptionist smiled the moment she saw me. "Good morning, Mr. Carter." "Morning, Lisa." She handed me a visitor badge, even though everyone in the building knew exactly who I was. 20 minutes later, I was sitting in a conference room overlooking the city skyline. Several people were already there waiting. Men and women in tailored suits. Financial advisors. Attorneys. Senior executives. One of them stood when I entered. "Congratulations, Bill." Another smiled. The board voted unanimously. I thanked them and took my seat. As the discussion continued, I found myself thinking about Susan. She would have laughed at the entire situation. She always said life had a strange sense of humor. The meeting lasted nearly 3 hours. When it finally ended, one of the executives walked beside me toward the elevator. "The public announcement is scheduled for next month," he said. "That timing still works for you?" "It does. There will be a lot of attention once the news breaks." I smiled. Attention was never the goal. He nodded. That is probably why people trust you. Later that afternoon, I stopped at a small diner on my way home. While I was finishing lunch, my phone buzzed. It was Emily. That alone was unusual. She almost never called me directly. Hello. I answered. Bill, I wanted to remind you about the family dinner next Saturday. Her tone was polite, but it felt rehearsed. I have it on my calendar. Good. My father invited several important people. I noticed the emphasis immediately. Important people. Sounds like a full house, I said. It will be. Then she added something that made me sit up a little straighter. Just try not to make things awkward. For a moment, I considered asking exactly what she meant. Instead, I said, I will do my best. After we hung up, I stared at the phone for several seconds. Something was changing. I could feel it. The assumptions. The quiet judgments. The little comments that had accumulated over the years. They were all moving toward something. That evening, Michael called again. This time his voice sounded even more uneasy. Dad, he said, I just got off the phone with Emily's father. How is Richard? Honestly, Michael exhaled slowly. I think he is nervous about something. That caught my attention immediately because men like Richard Whitmore were not known for being nervous. Did he say why? No. Michael paused. But he asked whether you were definitely coming next Saturday. I stood by the kitchen window looking out into the dark yard. For the first time, a feeling settled over me that I could not quite explain. Somewhere behind all these conversations, behind all the strange questions and careful wording, there was a truth nobody was talking about yet. And whatever it was getting closer. The week leading up to the dinner felt strange. Small things kept happening, and none of them made sense on their own. Together, though, they painted a picture I could not ignore. On Wednesday afternoon, I stopped by Michael and Emily's house to drop off a set of shelves I had built for their garage. Michael was still at work, so Emily answered the door. You built those? She asked, looking at the shelves. I did. You really should not spend so much time on projects like this. I smiled. Why not? She folded her arms. Because people start worrying about you. That caught me off guard. Worrying about me? My parents asked if you were doing okay financially. She said it casually, as if she were discussing the weather. And why would they ask that? Emily hesitated. Just for a second. People talk. Then she changed the subject. Later that evening, Michael called me. He sounded frustrated. Dad, did you tell someone you were having money problems? I nearly dropped the coffee mug in my hand. What? I am serious. Emily heard it from her mother. Patricia says several relatives have been discussing it. That is nonsense. I know it is nonsense. He paused. But somehow everybody seems convinced. For the next few days, the story grew. One person apparently heard I was struggling to maintain my house. Another believed I had sold investments years ago and spent the money. Someone else claimed I depended on Michael more than I admitted. None of it was true. The strange part was how confidently people repeated it. Nobody asked me directly. Nobody checked whether any of it made sense. They simply accepted it because it fit the image they already had in their minds. By Friday, even Michael sounded exhausted. I do not understand where this is coming from, he said. Neither do I. Then he lowered his voice. Dad, I think somebody is feeding them these stories on purpose. I sat quietly for a moment. Deep down, I already suspected that. The question was who. Saturday morning arrived. The day of the dinner. I spent most of it working in the yard. The physical work helped clear my head. Around noon, my phone rang again. This time it was Richard Whitmore. That surprised me. In all the years Michael and Emily had been married, Richard had never called me directly. Bill, he said. His voice sounded different than usual. Tense. Careful. Richard. There was a pause. I am looking forward to seeing you tonight. Likewise. Another pause. Then he said something odd. There are a few things we should probably discuss. I leaned against the porch railing. Such as, the line went quiet. Not over the phone. Before I could ask another question, he ended the call. The rest of the afternoon felt unusually long. By 6 o'clock, I was driving toward the Whitmore estate. Their property sat on several acres outside Brentwood, surrounded by stone walls and iron gates. Expensive cars lined the circular driveway. Valets moved back and forth. Guests dressed in tailored suits and designer dresses walked toward the entrance. As I parked my old truck, I noticed two men standing near the front steps. One of them glanced in my direction and whispered something to the other. Both looked away when they realized I had seen them. Inside the house, the atmosphere felt polished and rehearsed. Smiles, handshakes, polite conversation. Yet underneath it all, there was tension. The kind people try to hide. Then I overheard something that made my stomach drop. A woman I barely knew was speaking to another guest near the dining room entrance. I heard his son practically supports him now, she said. That is what Emily told us. The other woman nodded sympathetically. Such a shame. For a moment, the entire room seemed to go silent around me. Not because anyone had stopped talking. Because I finally understood. This was not a misunderstanding. It was not gossip that had accidentally spread. Somebody had carefully built this story piece by piece. And judging by the confidence with which people repeated it, they had been doing it for a long time. I stood there staring across the crowded room as Emily laughed with a group of relatives near the fireplace. And in that exact moment, I realized everything I thought I knew about my place in this family was about to come crashing down. For the rest of the evening, I tried to convince myself that I was overreacting. Maybe I had misunderstood what I heard. Maybe the rumors had taken on a life of their own. But the deeper I moved into the gathering, the harder it became to believe that. The same story kept appearing in different forms, told by different people, with different details attached to it. One man approached me near the dining room and smiled sympathetically. Retirement can be tough. My brother went through something similar. I thanked him, even though I had no idea what he was talking about. 20 minutes later, a woman I had never met touched my arm and said, "It is wonderful that Michael helps out so much. Families should stick together." Again, I smiled politely. Again, I said nothing. But inside, something felt heavier with every conversation. This was no longer one person's opinion. It had become a narrative, a story people repeated because they believed it explained who I was. When I got home that night, I sat in my kitchen long after midnight. The house was quiet. I looked at an old framed photograph of Susan on the counter. "You would not believe this," I said softly. The next morning, I decided to do something I rarely did. I tried to fix the situation. First, I called Patricia. The call went to voicemail. I left a short message. "Patricia, I think there may be some misunderstandings circulating. I would appreciate the chance to talk." She never returned the call. 2 days later, I sent an email. It was polite, respectful. I simply explained that several statements being repeated about me were inaccurate. No response. Then I mailed a handwritten letter. Susan always believed handwritten letters mattered because they showed effort. I spent nearly an hour writing it. I explained that I valued family and hoped we could clear up any confusion before it created unnecessary distance. A week passed. Nothing. Then another week. Still nothing. What surprised me most was not the silence from Emily's parents. It was the gradual change in other people. Friends of the family stopped reaching out. Invitations disappeared. Conversations became shorter. One afternoon, Michael called sounding frustrated. "Dad, I do not know what is happening." "What do you mean?" I asked. "People keep asking me if everything is okay with you." "And what do you tell them?" "The truth." He paused. "But it does not seem to matter." That was the hardest part. Facts moved slowly. Assumptions moved fast. Once people accepted a story, they defended it. A few days later, Michael forwarded me a message he had received from a distant relative connected to the Whitmores. The message read, "I hope your father lands on his feet. Pride can make life difficult when people refuse help." I stared at the screen for several seconds. The person who wrote it had never even spoken to me. Yet somehow they were certain they understood my life. Michael called immediately afterward. "Dad, I am sorry." "For what?" "For not seeing this sooner." I could hear genuine regret in his voice. "None of this is your fault," I said. "Maybe not. But I should have stepped in earlier." After we hung up, I walked outside and sat beneath the old oak tree Susan planted years ago. The afternoon sun filtered through the branches. Cars passed occasionally in the distance. For the first time in a very long while, I felt completely alone. Not because I lacked people around me, because I realized how easily a lie can isolate someone when enough people decide it sounds believable. And as I sat there listening to the wind move through the leaves, I had no idea that events already set in motion would soon force every person involved to confront a truth none of them were prepared to face. The weeks that followed were some of the quietest of my life. Not peaceful quiet. The other kind. The kind that settles in after phone calls stop coming and invitations stop arriving. I still woke up early every morning. I still made coffee and sat on the porch. But the silence felt different now. It felt heavier. One evening Michael came by after work. He looked tired. Older somehow. We sat outside as the sun disappeared behind the trees. Neither of us spoke for several minutes. Finally he said, "Dad, I think I have been blind." I looked at him. "About what?" He stared into his coffee cup. "About a lot of things." I did not answer. Sometimes people need space to reach their own conclusions. I kept telling myself they meant well, he continued. Every comment, every assumption, every little joke. I thought it was harmless. He shook his head. It was not harmless. For the first time in a long while, I saw genuine disappointment in his eyes. Not disappointment in me. Disappointment in himself. After he left, I found myself thinking about Susan again. Grief is a strange thing. It changes shape over the years, but it never completely leaves. Some nights I still expected to hear her footsteps in the hallway. Some mornings I still reached for the other side of the bed before remembering she was gone. During difficult times, she had always been the person who reminded me who I was. Without her, those reminders had become harder to find. A few days later, I visited the cemetery. The air was cool, and the grass had just been cut. I stood beside her headstone for nearly an hour. "You were right," I told her quietly. "Character matters." I laughed softly. "You probably knew all of this would happen before I did." A breeze moved through the trees. For the first time in months, I stopped thinking about what people believed about me. Instead, I started asking a different question. Why had I spent so many years allowing other people to define me? The answer was uncomfortable. Because it was easier. Easier to stay quiet. Easier to avoid conflict. Easier to let assumptions exist than challenge them. That realization stayed with me. It followed me home. It sat with me during dinner. It lingered in the back of my mind every morning. Then something unexpected happened. Richard called again. This time there was no small talk. No careful wording. "Bill," he said, "we need to meet." I could hear stress in his voice. Real stress. "What is this about?" I asked. Not over the phone. The exact same words he had used before. "Richard," I began. "Please." He interrupted me. "Just trust me." We agreed to meet later that week. After the call ended, I sat quietly in my living room. The old grandfather clock Susan loved ticked steadily against the wall. For months it felt like events had been happening around me while I simply endured them. But now something had changed. I could feel it. Not outside. Inside. The loneliness was still there. The disappointment was still there. But so was something else. Clarity. For the first time, I was no longer waiting for people to understand me. I was beginning to understand myself. That evening, just before sunset, another message appeared on my phone. It came from an unfamiliar number. There were only 8 words written in the text. "Be careful. Not everyone is telling the truth." I read the message 3 times. Then I looked out the window toward the darkening sky and realized that whatever was coming next had already begun. The following week became one of the busiest I had experienced in years. Not because I was chasing anything, but because I had finally stopped hiding parts of myself to make other people comfortable. On Tuesday morning, I met Richard at a private conference room overlooking downtown Nashville. He looked tired. The confident businessman everyone knew seemed older than the last time I had seen him. He closed the door behind him and sat down slowly. "Bill, there are things happening that you need to know." I listened without interrupting. For nearly an hour he spoke about business challenges, board disagreements, financial pressure, and decisions that had been made without his full control. Some of it surprised me. Some of it confirmed suspicions I already had. When he finished, he leaned back in his chair. "I made mistakes." It was the first time I had ever heard him say those words. "Most people do," I replied. "Not everyone admits them." He nodded. "That is fair. When we left the building, something had changed between us. Not friendship exactly. Respect." A few days later, I returned to my normal routine. I repaired a neighbor's fence. I volunteered at a local trade school twice a week. I started mentoring young contractors who were trying to build their own businesses. One of them, a 26-year-old named Tyler, showed up every Thursday evening with a notebook full of questions. "How do you know if someone is trustworthy?" he asked one night. I laughed. "You usually do not." "That is not very encouraging." "No," I said, "but you learn to watch actions instead of words." He wrote that down immediately. Another student asked me why I spent time helping them. "Because somebody helped me once," I answered. "And because experience is useless if you keep it to yourself." The weeks passed quickly. For the first time in a long while, my days felt purposeful again. Not because I was proving anyone wrong. Because I had stopped measuring my worth through other people's opinions. Michael noticed the difference almost immediately. One Saturday afternoon, he stopped by unexpectedly. We spent nearly 3 hours working on my truck together. At one point, he looked over at me and smiled. "You seem different." "Different how?" "Lighter." I tightened a bolt and shrugged. Maybe I finally got tired of carrying things that never belonged to me. He thought about that for a moment. "I wish Mom could see this." I smiled softly. "I think she probably can." Before leaving, Michael hesitated near the driveway. "Dad." "Yeah." "There are some conversations happening that I do not fully understand." My attention sharpened immediately. "What kind of conversations?" "Business conversations." He looked uneasy. "People are asking questions." "Important people." "About what?" "About you." He laughed nervously. "Honestly, I do not think they realize how much they do not know." After he left, I stood beside the truck watching the sun set behind the trees. The air felt different somehow. The future felt different. A few days later, I received an invitation to attend another gathering. Much smaller than the last one. Much more exclusive. At the bottom of the invitation was a list of attendees. As I read through the names, I recognized nearly every one of them. Chief executives, investors, board members, people whose decisions affected entire companies. Then I noticed one final detail written at the very bottom. Special announcement scheduled during dinner. I read that sentence twice. Then I smiled. Because for the first time, I had a feeling I knew exactly what was coming. The dinner took place 10 days later at a private club overlooking the Cumberland River. The building itself was understated from the outside, but inside it was filled with polished wood, framed photographs, and the kind of quiet confidence that comes from people who no longer need to prove they belong in the room. When I arrived, a young attendant greeted me immediately. "Good evening, Mr. Carter. They are expecting you upstairs." I nodded and followed him toward a private elevator. Years ago, that sort of treatment would have made me uncomfortable. Now it simply felt normal. Not because I thought I was more important than anyone else, but because I had finally stopped pretending to be less than I was. The elevator opened directly into a large conference dining room. A brass plaque beside the entrance caught my eye. It listed the members of the Executive Advisory Board. Near the top was my name, William Carter, Chairman. I stared at it for a second before walking inside. For most of my life, titles never meant much to me. Character mattered more. Work mattered more. But that plaque represented something deeper. It represented decades of effort that nobody saw. Sacrifices nobody applauded. Risks nobody remembered. One by one, people entered the room. Some were old colleagues. Others were executives I had worked with only recently. Several greeted me warmly. "Bill, good to see you. Congratulations again. Looking forward to tonight." A younger executive named Rachel pulled out a chair beside her. "You know, half the people in this room still underestimate you." I laughed. "Only half." She laughed too. "Fair point." As the evening continued, I noticed something that would have surprised me a year earlier. I was not nervous. I was not seeking approval. I was not rehearsing explanations in my head. I simply belonged there. During dinner, discussions moved from business strategy to community projects and future investments. At one point, a guest asked how I had managed to stay grounded despite decades of success. I thought about that for a moment before answering. Losing people you love tends to clarify what actually matters. The room grew quiet. Then several heads nodded. Later, as dessert was served, Richard stood to make a short announcement. He looked much stronger than the last time we met privately. The uncertainty that had followed him for months seemed to be fading. "Before we conclude tonight," he said, "I want to recognize someone whose leadership has guided this organization through a very important transition." Several people turned toward me immediately. Richard smiled. "Bill, would you stand for a moment?" I did. The room filled with applause. Not loud or theatrical. Genuine. Respectful. For a brief second, I wished Susan could have seen it. Then I realized something important. I did not need the applause. The real victory had happened long before tonight. It happened the moment I stopped allowing other people to define my worth. After the event ended, I walked toward the parking area overlooking the river. The city lights reflected across the water. My phone vibrated in my pocket. It was a message from Michael. "Dad, are you free this weekend? Emily and I need to talk to you." I stood there reading the message twice. The timing was not a coincidence. Deep down, I knew that. Whatever had been hidden for months was finally moving into the open. And as I looked out across the Nashville skyline, I realized I had arrived at the exact point where the story first began. That Saturday arrived with the kind of gray Tennessee sky that makes everything feel quieter than usual. I spent most of the morning in my garage organizing tools I did not really need to organize. The truth was I knew the conversation with Michael and Emily was coming, and I wanted something to keep my hands busy. Around noon, Michael pulled into the driveway. Emily was in the passenger seat. Neither of them got out immediately. Through the windshield, I could see them talking. Then the doors opened. Michael walked toward me first. Emily followed a few steps behind. For the first time since I had known her, she looked uncertain. We sat on the back porch. Nobody spoke for nearly a minute. Finally, Michael broke the silence. "Dad, thank you for meeting with us." I almost smiled. We were sitting at my house. There was nowhere else I would have been. "What is going on?" I asked. Michael looked toward Emily. She stared down at her hands. "Emily," I said gently. She took a breath. "There are things I need to tell you." The words seemed difficult for her. Not because she did not know them. Because she had probably rehearsed them too many times. "Go ahead," I said. Another long pause followed. The old wind chime near the porch roof moved softly in the breeze. Somewhere in the distance a dog barked. Small, ordinary sounds that somehow made the moment feel even heavier. "My father wants to meet with you," Emily finally said. That surprised me. "Richard and I have already met." Both of them looked shocked. "You have?" Michael asked. "A few times." Neither spoke. The balance of the conversation shifted immediately. For months, I had been the person receiving information, asking questions, trying to understand what everyone else already seemed to know. Suddenly, that was no longer true. Michael leaned forward. "Dad, what exactly is going on?" I looked at him. "I think the better question is why everybody keeps acting like I am the last person allowed to know." Neither answered. Emily swallowed hard. "Because everything got out of control." "What did?" She looked away again. "The assumptions. The stories. The conversations." For a moment I considered saying more. Instead, I waited. Silence can be surprisingly powerful. People often reveal more when you stop rushing to fill it. Eventually, Emily spoke again. "My father is gathering several family members tomorrow evening." "For what purpose?" She hesitated. "To explain everything." Michael looked frustrated. "Explain what?" Emily shook her head. "I am not the one who should do it." That answer only increased the tension. The conversation drifted for another half hour without anyone truly saying what needed to be said. Every answer seemed to lead toward another locked door. Every explanation felt incomplete. Eventually they left. As Michael climbed into his truck, he stopped and looked back at me. "Dad, yeah. No matter what happens tomorrow." He paused. "I hope you know I never stopped loving you." I nodded. "I know." After they drove away, I sat alone on the porch watching the afternoon fade into evening. My phone buzzed shortly before sunset. It was a message from Richard. "Tomorrow, 6 o'clock. Please be there." No additional details. No explanation. Just a location and a time. The address belonged to the same estate where everything had started months earlier. I looked at the message for a long moment before locking my phone. Whatever truth had been moving beneath the surface all this time was finally ready to emerge. And less than 24 hours later, I would walk into a room filled with people who thought they understood the story, just moments before discovering how wrong they really were. The following evening, I arrived exactly at 6 o'clock. The Whitmore estate looked almost identical to the last time I had been there, but the atmosphere felt completely different. There was no music drifting through the hallways. No casual conversations. No groups gathered around drinks. People stood in small clusters speaking quietly, waiting. When I entered the main room, several heads turned toward me immediately. Then the conversation stopped. Richard was standing near the fireplace. Michael and Emily were beside him. So were Patricia and several members of the extended family. I noticed attorneys, board members, a few executives I recognized from recent meetings. Whatever was about to happen had been carefully arranged. Richard walked toward me first. "Thank you for coming, Bill. You said it was important." He nodded. "It is." He then turned toward everyone else in the room. "I think it is time." The room became completely silent. Richard took a slow breath. For the first time since I had known him, he seemed less like a businessman and more like a father trying to correct a mistake. "Many of you have heard rumors over the past year," he began. "Some of those rumors should never have existed." Nobody interrupted. Several assumptions were made about a member of this family. Assumptions that were accepted as fact without verification. Patricia lowered her eyes. Emily remained motionless. Richard continued. What concerns me is not that people were mistaken. It is how comfortable everyone became with being mistaken. One of his cousins shifted uncomfortably. Another stared at the floor. Then Richard turned toward me. Bill, would you come stand beside me? I walked across the room. Every eye followed me. Richard looked at the group and spoke calmly. Some of you know that our company underwent major ownership changes recently. A few people nodded. Others looked confused. What most of you do not know is who made those changes possible. An older executive near the back of the room stepped forward. Perhaps I can help explain. I recognized him immediately. He was one of the senior board members. He opened a folder and spoke in a professional tone. Approximately 11 months ago, a controlling acquisition process began. Several organizations were evaluated. Multiple offers were considered. In the end, one individual became the primary investor and eventual majority owner. The room remained silent. Then he looked directly at me. That individual is William Carter. For several seconds, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. It was as if the entire room had forgotten how. Then came the reactions. A sharp intake of breath from one corner. A whispered "what?" from somewhere near the doorway. Someone actually dropped a napkin they had been holding. The executive continued. Mr. Carter currently serves as chairman and holds final authority regarding strategic decisions affecting the organization. More silence followed. Richard spoke next. For months, many of you discussed Bill as though you understood his circumstances. He paused. The reality is that some of the most important decisions affecting this company now require his approval. Nobody looked at me anymore. They looked at each other. Suddenly people were replaying every conversation they had ever had. Every assumption, every conclusion, every careless judgment. Finally, Emily spoke. Her voice was barely above a whisper. Dad. Richard turned toward her. Yes. You knew? For quite some time. She looked completely stunned. And you never told me? Richard's answer was calm. You never asked the right questions. The words landed harder than any accusation could have. Emily stared at him, then at me. For the first time since I had known her, she seemed genuinely unable to find something to say. Then the senior executive added one final detail. The official public announcement goes live tomorrow morning. The room froze again, because now everyone understood something else. This truth was no longer private. By sunrise, the entire business community would know exactly who William Carter was. The room remained quiet long after the announcement. Nobody rushed to speak. Nobody seemed quite sure what to do with the information they had just received. For months, perhaps years, people had built an image of me based on assumptions. Now they were being forced to replace that image with reality, and reality was far more complicated than the story they had told themselves. Richard eventually broke the silence. There is one more thing everyone should understand. He looked around the room carefully. Bill did not acquire ownership through luck. He did not inherit it. He earned the trust of every institution, advisor, and board member involved in the process. The senior executive standing nearby nodded. Every stage of the acquisition required extensive review. Financial audits, leadership evaluations, strategic planning assessments. Mr. Carter exceeded expectations in every category. That explanation mattered. It was not magic. It was not a surprise twist that appeared from nowhere. It was the result of decades of work most people had never bothered to ask about. Across the room, I could see family members quietly processing that reality. Patricia was the first to approach me. Her expression looked different than I had ever seen before. Less certain, more honest. Bill, she said softly, I owe you an apology. I looked at her without speaking. I should have asked questions instead of accepting answers from other people. I nodded slowly. That would have helped. She lowered her eyes. You deserved better than that. For the first time all evening, I believed someone was speaking from the heart. A few minutes later, Emily walked over. Michael stood beside her. Neither looked comfortable. Bill, she began, then stopped. Whatever speech she had prepared seemed to disappear. Finally, she tried again. I was wrong. The words came out quietly. About what? I asked. She blinked. The question clearly surprised her. About you. I waited. She took a breath. I thought I understood who you were. No, I replied calmly. You thought you understood what mattered. That landed harder than anger ever could have. She looked away. Michael stepped forward. Dad, nobody can change what happened. I know, but I hope we can figure out where to go from here. I studied my son for a moment. Then I nodded. That depends on actions, not promises. He accepted that immediately. No argument. No excuses. Just a quiet nod. Later in the evening, several relatives approached with similar conversations. Some apologized. Some tried to explain themselves. Others simply looked embarrassed. I listened politely, but something inside me had changed. For years I had measured family relationships through patience and endurance. Now I understood that healthy relationships also require boundaries. Respect cannot exist without them. Before leaving, Richard pulled me aside near the entrance hall. I appreciate how you handled tonight. I smiled slightly. What alternative did I have? He laughed softly. You had several. We both knew he was right. He became serious again. I hope this can be repaired. I looked back toward the room where family members continued talking quietly among themselves. Some things can be repaired. And the others? He asked. I thought about that for a moment. The others require time. Richard nodded. He understood exactly what I meant. When I finally stepped outside, the evening air felt cool against my face. The driveway lights stretched across the property in long golden lines. Behind me, conversations continued inside the house. Ahead of me, my truck waited near the gate. For the first time, the truth was no longer hidden. The masks were gone. The assumptions were gone. But forgiveness is not the same thing as trust. And as I started the engine and drove into the Tennessee night, I knew there were still conversations waiting that none of us were fully ready to have. Life did not magically become perfect after that night. Real life rarely works that way. But it did become clearer, quieter, more honest. Over the months that followed, some relationships grew stronger, while others remained distant. And strangely enough, I was at peace with both outcomes. Michael and I became closer than we had been in years. We started spending Saturday mornings together again, just like we did when he was a kid. Sometimes we worked on projects in the garage. Sometimes we sat on the porch drinking coffee and talking about ordinary things. The kind of conversations that remind you what really matters. Emily changed too. Not overnight. Real change never happens overnight. But she began asking questions instead of making assumptions. She listened more. She spoke less. Trust was not rebuilt through apologies. It was rebuilt through consistent actions, one day at a time. Richard and I continued working together professionally, but something else developed between us as well. Mutual respect. Not because we agreed on everything, but because we had both learned how expensive pride can become when left unchecked. As for me, I continued living in the same house beneath the same oak tree Susan planted all those years ago. I still drove the same truck. I still woke up before sunrise. The things that mattered most had not changed. Only my understanding of them had. Looking back now, I realized this story was never really about money, status, or business. It was about identity. It was about what happens when other people decide who you are before they take the time to know you. It was about the danger of allowing someone else's opinion to become louder than your own sense of self. One of the hardest lessons I learned is that kindness and silence are not always the same thing. For years I thought enduring misunderstandings made me strong. Sometimes it did. But sometimes strength means speaking the truth calmly and refusing to carry responsibilities that belong to someone else. Boundaries are not walls. They are doors. They allow healthy people to enter while protecting your peace from those who refuse to respect it. Another lesson I learned is that your financial independence, emotional independence, and self-respect are deeply connected. Protect them. Build them. Nurture them. Never hand the responsibility for your worth to another person. Because the moment someone else becomes responsible for defining your value, you give away a piece of yourself that was never theirs to own. If you are listening to this right now and you feel misunderstood, overlooked, or judged unfairly, I want you to hear something from an old man who learned this lesson later than he should have. The opinions surrounding you may be loud, but they are not necessarily true. The labels people place on you may feel heavy, but they do not determine your future. Keep building your life. Keep protecting your peace. Keep becoming the person you know you are meant to be. And trust that in time, truth has a way of finding daylight. Personally, I believe God gives us moments of discomfort not to break us, but to reveal what we have been unwilling to see. Looking back, every difficult conversation, every disappointment, every lonely afternoon pointed me toward a better understanding of myself. For that, I am grateful. My name is William Carter. I am 72 years old, and the core lesson I want to leave with you is this. Never allow other people's assumptions to become the foundation of your identity. Before I go, thank you for spending part of your day with me. Truly, in a world where so many people feel isolated, your time is one of the greatest gifts you can give. Whether you are listening from a small town, a big city, or somewhere halfway around the world, I hope this story reminded you that you are not alone in your struggles. And if it touched your heart in some way, I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Feel free to share your own experiences, and if you think someone else might need this message today, consider sharing it with them. If you enjoyed this journey and would like to hear more stories about family, resilience, healing, and unexpected life lessons, make sure you subscribe and explore the rest of the playlist waiting for you. There are more stories ahead, more people with lessons worth sharing, more moments that might help you see your own life from a different perspective. Until then, take care of yourself, trust your instincts, and remember that sometimes the strongest people are not the ones who prove everyone wrong, but the ones who never lose themselves while everyone else is busy misunderstanding them. And as the sun set behind the old oak tree outside my porch that evening, its branches moving gently in the Tennessee breeze Susan once loved so much, I realized that peace begins the moment you stop asking the world to tell you who you are and finally decide that you already know.